Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everyone to the International Quranic Translators Conference of 2023. This is a very great conversation on the Quranic translation, a project that has been done by many scholars, people from around the world. And this is a great conference that we have today. Welcome to this conference. Good morning to friends in the US, good afternoon friends in Asia, in Europe, and some of the African countries. We're gonna have a first session today. Actually, this is the second day of our conference, and we're gonna have a great scholar speakers today. We have 6 speakers plus 1 keynote speakers. I will start with Dr. Ahmer Bilal Soofi. Ahmer Bilal Soofi is a well-known international lawyer from South Asia and ex-federal law minister of Pakistan. He is currently member of ICC Court of Arbitration in Paris. He has represented before ICG and other international judicial forums. He chaired Advisory Council of Human Rights in Geneva. He also remained president of WWF Pakistan. And Mr. Soofi leads a globally ranked law firm, EBS and Co., and is founder of leading think tank, the Research Society of International Law, that emphasizes understanding of international law. His most recent project is the Quran Covenant Center, the QCC, an initiative that highlights the covenant structure of the Quran and consequently is defining legal implication on the believers via enhanced obligation to uphold private contract, legislative covenant, and international treaties. He is nearing completion of his detailed and unique study on the Quran covenant. Mr. Ahmer Bilal Soofi, you have 15 minutes sharp, and please, the platform is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The Quran's message can be categorized in various manners. It can be viewed as a message delivered to the people of Arabia as an extensive sermon or a speech. Its divinity can be considered its basic feature. It can be viewed as a manual for humankind, or it can be viewed from a historical perspective. It can also be looked as a book of modern science by those who specialized in the field. It can be classified from a sociological lens as a book of social cohesion. It can also be taken as a book of rich literature. And at the same time, it can be looked as a book containing laws of Sharia. While there exists scholarship around a number of these facets, not much work has been undertaken which attempts to explore the Quran as a book whose fundamental architecture is legal or contractual in nature. One way to conceptualize this is to draw an analogy to the basic structure theory in the constitutional law developed by the superior courts of common law states. The theory argues that there exists a central theme and structure around which various provisions of the constitutional treaties are woven. In the same way, the covenant framework emerges as an important feature of the Quranic design around which the supplemental directions, advice, caution notes, assurances, warnings, and so forth are woven. Just as a fruit-laden tree often hides the design and architecture of its branches behind its abundant foliage, the covenant framework is also not immediately identifiable. The word covenant is used in its widest sense in the study. It includes not only, the word covenant is used in its widest sense in the study. It includes not only formal agreements, but also orally agreed understandings and implied covenant. It also contains representations, warranties, unilateral assertions or declarations by Allah, standing offers, and even assertions with the intent to be bound by the same. The designation of such an agreement as contract, covenant, or treaty does not much make difference, as all of these are covenants, provided there exists an indication in the Quran itself that upon the acceptance of a certain condition or assertion, the performance of a certain act, or upon the exercise of restraint to act in a certain manner, there will certainly follow some reward or consequence, including punishment, that is mentioned either in general or specific terms in the Quran. The covenant stands formed once a person does any of the above in consideration of a gain as promised by Allah, whether the consideration is material or not. Such an agreement that is to be formed need not be entered into formally, but may be established or deduced through the parties' relation and mutual course of conduct. These can be viewed as having the status of Ahad Allah. Sharia is the name given to body of law meant for believers to implement both in their personal and state affairs. Although the Quran is often viewed as book of Islamic or Sharia law, interestingly, there are very few legal provisions enforceable by the state. Out of over 6,000 verses of the Quran, only 100 deal with compulsory ritual practices like prayers and fasting and pilgrimage. 70 verses discuss personal law. About 70 deal with civil matters, and only 30 contain penal laws. In addition, around 20 verses relate to administration of justice. Some scholars count them differently. These small percentage of verses are clubbed together as the law of Sharia that is to be enforced at a government level as and when the Islamic government comes to power. So then, what is the legal nature of the remaining contents of the Quran? It is submitted that the same is like a private covenant between Allah and each of his believers. They can also be seen as numerous sub-covenants that are embedded in the master covenant of the Quran. They all, in one way or the other, package within them the dominant core message about the oneness of Allah. The remaining contents include warranties about Allah's supreme powers, his prophets, his books, and representations of the unseen day of judgment in bringing us all back to life. It is the term of the covenant to believe in all these representations. Sharia can also be called a substantive law drawn from the Quran, which deals with a variety of subjects relating to offenses, trials, and punishments. This is the law that regulates believers in this world. However, as mentioned above, its prerequisite is an existence of an Islamic state. Unless that state comes into existence, the traditional Sharia law relating to offenses, economy, or even, for instance, almsgiving cannot be institutionally enforced. The believer not living in an Islamic country can on their own direct their conduct following Sharia with respect for the statutory covenant that they have with Almighty. The greater the realization of the believer that they have been fulfilling the contractual terms executed between them and their Creator, the greater will be the keenness to continue implementing them. So while Sharia may be imposed by the government of today, regardless of the nature of the government itself, democracy, dictatorship, caliphate, the believer is obliged to honor the covenant they have with the Creator as a matter of personal obligation towards Allah. In other words, the contractual obligation towards Allah should be distinguished from the criminal law jurisprudence provided in the Quran. While there is one way of assessing the covenant-like nature of Quran, another is to look at the substance of the address and the nature of instructions or promises and to infer therefrom whether it is a covenant. This is a more purposive approach as opposed to the former, which is a textual approach. And it tells us that the dominant character of the Quranic verses is that of a pact or a legal contract with multiple entities and creations, including humans, as its subjects. In my work, I am exploring such pacts, pledges, and frameworks. If one were to focus on the substance of statements made in the Quran to ascertain whether they create multiple obligations between the addressor and the addressee, then one may find a plethora of examples. The contents of the statements, narrations, or events in the Quran often thus create certain relationships that can be identified as having contractual features. It is a recognized principle of contract law today that even the mere conduct of parties can give rise to the contractual obligations. When we look at some key phrases such as promise or pact in the Quran, we may be unwittingly narrowing the scope of our research. The contemporary law uses multiple names and titles to describe the relationship of parties in which one party commits in any form to perform an obligation towards the other for a consideration. The nomenclature of the relationship is not important. It is the substance that determines the character and the legal features of the relationship that the parties share between them. Certain actions or inactions, for instance, oral assent or acceptance by conduct on part of one party, can constitute establishing a binding relationship between Allah and the believer. Similarly, the modern law of contract notes that the offeree who does nothing or says nothing in response to an offer is not bound by it. Another form of covenant discussed is the unilateral representation by Allah of His power, might, and ability to change fate, events, hearts, and minds. It may appear as a statement guaranteeing or promising a specific outcome in case the offeree agrees to a certain behavior. It may take the shape of a notice giving a warning in a certain time for course correction. There remains a direct or indirect quid pro quo element in the transaction or relationship. It is submitted that the Quranic verses embody a covenant-based relationship between the author of the covenant and several entities such as Iblis, the jinn, his own messengers, and each member of his human race. The work that I am undertaking also looks at the covenants that are executed before the Quran, but they are mentioned in the Quran. And they are, for example, the covenant of Allah with the spirits of the human, which is the Alast contract, the covenant by Allah with Himself, which is in the nature of a unilateral undertaking to run the universe up to a certain point in time. And then there is a covenant by Allah with the entire human race to act as a sustainer of the human race. And of course, we are familiar with the covenant that He had with Iblis, allowing him to time till the day of judgment. And in addition to that, there is a covenant of a consignor and a consignee, whereby Allah has made it a point to make sure that His message travels to each one of us. So the consignment of the message is received by each one of us today, living anywhere. And apart from that, the Quran also serves as a covenant of title of the properties and the title of the entire mass and material of the universe. It is like a title document, and He says it belongs to Him. Then there are a set of covenants pursuant to Quran or under the Quran itself. The major ones are the covenant between Allah and the believers, which is in the nature of a standard term contract offered to the believers to accept it. And when they pronounce a kalma, that's an acceptance of the offer made by Allah. And then subsequent sub-covenants trigger. Another main covenant is the one with the non-believers. With the non-believers, it has an adversarial relation whereby they are being warned. And that relationship has its own disclosure of punishments, complete disclosure of what is going to be received if you continue to be a non-believer, and putting the non-believer on notice that he has time during his life to do the course correction. Then the Quran also authorizes and mandates that human beings can enter into contract with human beings. In other words, covenant by humans with humans. This could take the form of private contracts that we do in our daily life. They are mandated by Quran. This could take the form of legislative covenants, which may include the laws of the land where we live, because they are also part of social contract that we have in any state, whether we are living in a state of non-believers or in a state of believers. We have a constitutional obligation or a duty or a covenant. And therefore, Quran is basically telling us, honor the law of the land where you live, unless, of course, the law is in deviation of your basic principles of Quran. And then finally, international treaties and conventions. They have to be honored by one state of believers with the other. And if there is an individual obligation pursuant to an international convention, that also needs to be honored. So if there's an international obligation relating to rights of laborers, relating to protection of environment, then that obligation has to be discharged by a believer in his own life personally as well. And that discharge of that obligation will be viewed as fulfilling the mandate given by the Quran itself. In addition to that, there are list of Allah's warranties and representations. There's a covenant of a regulator that he regulates our life in our own interest to balance various competing interests of various communities, nations, and people. He also has a covenant with his prophets, his attorneys and envoys to protect their honor, and the consequences of failure to protect the honor by any nation where they have been sent have also been disclosed. In addition to that, there are about 30 plus covenants that are mentioned in the Quran, whereby Allah has given a very explicit disclosure of them, that if we perform certain acts, we are entitled to certain benefits of access. For example, one of the major covenants is the covenant to access, meaning we can have access to Allah as and when we so desire. There is a covenant made by him that whenever you will reach out to me, I am available. There is no gatekeeper for access. There is a covenant of communication. I will communicate as and when you want to communicate with me. I am listening to whatever communication you are making. There is a covenant for prayer, that there is whatever prayers you make, I will answer them. There is a covenant for gratitude. If you offer gratitude, I will respond and I will benefit you even more. There is a specific covenant to grant forgiveness, that if you grant forgiveness to others, and I will also forgive you. There's a covenant of mercy, covenant of granting refuge. Believers can have private covenants with Allah. Covenants of generosity is there. There's a covenant of a debtor and creditor. There's a covenant relating to excellence, that you have to excel in this world because you means the believer are the finest product of Allah. And he has made this claim, and there is an implied covenant to excel in the worldly roles that we possess, whether we are doctors, whether we are literature students, whether we are research scholars, whether we are into computers. We need to excel in that worldly role. And excellence is basically proving the claim of our being the best species he has created. So hence there is an implied covenant to excel. So you have covenant with entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. There's a long list of those covenants, and that is to be found in my article that I have also flagged, I believe, in my introduction. So those who wish to read more about it. So let me conclude. Is that Quran is inextricably linked with the modern world and its practices. Its relevance to the present times is grossly understated. Some of us think of it as a respected relic of the past that should stay in the past, or we take it as a well-revered historic milestone that has been left behind in history. On the contrary, as this book to some extent is able to relate to the Quran with the modern laws and international conventions, this work will also show that Quran not only endorses them, but actually encourages the believers to follow both modern domestic and international laws as part of their religious duty. If the modern believer is able to see the connection between their everyday life and the Quran, which surely exists, they will realize that the Quran is a contemporary manual or a perfect constitution for group living. Let us not stand between the Quran and its intrinsic connection with the modern propositions in our daily life. That is where the covenant-based relation is crucial to recognize. Allah has a direct and uninterrupted contractual relation between a believer and himself on many counts, as I have indicated. Thank you very much.